Hello, good evening. Happy Pride, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Chris Mosier. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm speaking to you today from the traditional unceded homelands of the Council of Three Fires, also known as Chicago. I am a white person with brown hair and a brown curly mustache, wearing a blue chambray button-up shirt, and standing in front of a wall full of bike tires and a black racing bicycle. I am a six-time member of Team USA, and in 2020, I became the first transgender athlete to compete in the Olympic trials in the gender category of their identity. I'm also the founder of transathlete.com, a resource of trans-inclusive policies at various levels of play. As both a lifelong athlete and now as someone tracking and fighting a record number of anti-transgender bills across the country, I know personally how damaging bills attacking the LGBTQ plus community can be and why we need protections. I'm honored to be here with you tonight in community to celebrate the end of Pride Month with our three amazing panelists who will provide more insight on where we are currently and where we hope to go, and perhaps more importantly, how you can take action. Before we get to that, I just want to give a big thank you to Lush Cosmetics for putting this event on, and to Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, Equality Florida, and Freedom for All Americans for the representation and support tonight as well. Throughout the event, we'll have calls to action in our chat box, and we hope that you'll engage. And we'd also love to take your questions as well, so please drop them in the chat, and we'll answer as many as we can towards the end of the event. Now, we have a lot of great information and conversation ahead, so let's just get right to it. Allow me to very briefly introduce our highly decorated panelists, and please realize this is just a sliver of their bios and accomplishments just to get us started. First off, Nadine Smith is the Executive Director of Equality Florida, the state's largest organization dedicated to ending discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. She currently serves as chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Florida Advisory Committee. She's also a Florida Chamber Foundation trustee and was one of 4 national co-chairs of the 1993 March on Washington. She served on the founding board of the International Gay and Lesbian Youth Organization, and we are thrilled to have Nadine with us tonight. Next up, Andy Hong Mera is the Executive Director of Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, an organization committed to ending discrimination based upon gender identity and expression, and to achieving equality for transgender people through public education, test case litigation, direct legal services, and public policy efforts. Andy currently serves as board chair for the Freedom for All Americans Education Fund, and has been honored by the White House and the City of New York for her contributions to the LGBTQ community. Andy, thrilled that you are here with us. And finally, Casey Suffredini is a nationally recognized campaign strategist and expert in LGBTQ issue advocacy. As CEO and national campaign director at Freedom for All Americans, Casey has been the chief architect of bipartisan campaigns to successfully secure a number of national firsts, including passing the country's first standalone statewide transgender public accommodations law, passing comprehensive statewide transgender non-discrimination protections for the first time in a Republican-controlled state, and passing comprehensive statewide LGBTQ non-discrimination protections for the first time in the South. Casey, thrilled you're here with us as well. Let's start with the basics. We're going to jump right in, and I'm going to ask you, Casey, to kick us off with a meta definition of what the Equality Act is.
A great intro, and thank you to the entire Lush team for having us today and really investing over many years in this issue. So right now there are 29 states that lack explicit protections for LGBTQ people from being evicted from an apartment, fired from a job, refused service in a public place just because of who they are. And the community has been trying actually for nearly 50 years to fix this. And this year we actually have a historic opportunity to do so by passing a federal bill through Congress that would protect all LGBTQ people nationwide. And that bill is called the Equality Act. It would update our nation's civil rights laws to expressly prohibit discrimination against LGBTQ people in virtually all areas of daily life. It has already passed the US House. It is waiting for a vote in the Senate. And we're doing everything we can to try to get it through the Senate and to the president's desk this year.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much for that. Andy, is there anything you'd like to add?
As Casey said, thank you, Lush, and everyone else tuning in for this discussion. It's a really interesting moment that we're in as a larger LGBTQ plus movement. I think that it's worth noting that, especially for trans and non-binary people, we have never seen the kind of visibility of our lived experiences as we are today. And at the same time, we also know that trans and non-binary people continue to be victimized, continue to be targeted by anti-LGBTQ plus forces to derail progress of our movement. The Equality Act is a bill that has been in existence more or less for almost 50 years. Our movement has been fighting for federal non-discrimination protections for decades, and we are at a point where the stars have aligned. And our movement has made a significant investment in advancing the Equality Act and building momentum for the Senate to pass it, as well as for President Biden to sign it into law. And I think what's really important to underscore is that the vast majority of Americans in the United States overwhelmingly support LGBTQ plus non-discrimination protections. Close to 3/4 of folks across the country, as well as a majority of Americans on both sides of the political aisle, whether you identify as a progressive, a conservative, a liberal, or a moderate. Everyone agrees, the vast majority of this country agrees that we need these non-discrimination protections in place.
Yeah, thank you. Such a critical moment right now. Nadine, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I just want to underscore just how broad the support for these protections are. In fact, many people are shocked when they discover these protections are not already in place all across the country. And even in the places where we have been successful in passing local ordinances or getting our state to embrace the Bostock ruling, the need for the Equality Act isn't diminished because it includes and embeds a standard nationwide. You should not have to wonder as you drive across the country, does this local community have these protections? Does this state have the same ones that I just moved out of? And so, what we are seeing both at the national level is, 70% of Americans support the full range of protections from marriage equality to basic non-discrimination. And a majority of Republicans, for the first time in the latest polling, are there on marriage equality, and support among older adults, which has been one of the harder demographics to get through, is up to 60%. And so in a state like Florida, where Republicans have held control of the legislature ever since Equality Florida was founded nearly 25 years ago, it's important to note that the majority of self-identified conservative Republican primary voters said, all things being equal, they would support the candidate who was good on LGBT issues. So, it is a new day. It is time for these protections to be embedded in federal law, and that equality be the law of the land.
Thank you. Those statistics and that layout, Nadine, is really important, and I think that is a great segue into talking about. This is such an important and historic piece of legislation. So I'm wondering, Andy, if you could kick us off, I'd love for us to expand a little bit more about this moment in time. Where are we historically, culturally, and legislatively, so we can paint the picture of sort of the current state of affairs?
Yeah, I think, just to build off of what Nadine shared a moment ago, there has never been as much support for the Equality Act as we see today. There have been hundreds of Fortune 500 companies that have signed on in support of the Equality Act. There's a number of faith leaders, there's a number of celebrities and influencers, and as well as a groundswell of support across the country for this legislation to pass. I think what is important to note, though, as we're building momentum to get the Senate to pass this bill and get it to the president's desk, we're also seeing, or we have seen, a wave of anti-LGBTQ plus legislation enter into state legislatures coast to coast and in between. And I think in particular, trans and non-binary people have been the latest straw people or the latest targets to demonize and ultimately to derail progress for building this kind of momentum to pass the Equality Act. We know that anti-LGBTQ forces are manufacturing and engineering many of the bills that popped up in state chambers across the country this past state legislative season. And the top 5 organizations, ranging from the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Heritage Foundation, and so on, they have been the ones providing the model legislation to lawmakers to convince them to introduce into state chambers, not because constituents of lawmakers are asking for these anti-LGBTQ plus bills, particularly anti-trans legislation, but because our opponents on the other side of the aisle are afraid that the Equality Act is going to pass, and they are going to do everything that they can to stop progress.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's just been heartbreaking to see as a transgender American that nearly half of these bills introduced this year did target the trans community. And as an athlete, nearly half of those targeted young people playing sports with their friends. And we had the attacks on trans people's access to healthcare as well. So yeah, so important. It's just been, as you mentioned, increased visibility and also increased attacks. I'd love to open it up to Casey or Nadine to expand on the where we're at historically, culturally, legislatively, any additions to what Andy had mentioned.
Well, Florida sort of occupies a unique space when it comes to anti-LGBT legislation and its history. From the Johns Committee, a state legislative body whose sole job was to find and destroy the lives of LGBT students and teachers and university faculty, along with civil rights activists. And then you have, of course, Anita Bryant and her Save Our Children campaign that swept the nation and left in its wake laws that literally took children away from their parents simply for being part of the LGBT community. And so, that has been a history that we've been working very hard to undo in Florida. And so what we have is the passage of a lot of local ordinances. City councils and county commissions and mayors have led where our state legislature has failed. So the majority of Floridians have lived in places that have these protections at the local level. But what we are seeing in Florida is the repeal, or the the state taking those powers increasingly away from duly elected local officials. And we need to not be in the place where these hard-fought gains are vulnerable to that kind of overreach at the state level. So, for us, I think the moment that we're in is very reminiscent of the attacks on the trans community, around public accommodations, around sports. These are the same kinds of attacks that the gay community, I remember Sam Nunn measuring the distance between bunks on a submarine when gay people serving openly in the military was the debate. Now that seems, foolish, old-fashioned, and out of step. And one day, these attacks on the trans community in particular, that have been the tip of the spear for the far right now, will also be seen as an embarrassing chapter. But in the meantime, it's doing a great deal of harm, and we've got to push back, both in order to move forward with federal legislation, but also, we know what happens when they find a wedge issue and they dehumanize an entire category of people, that there's real harm. It's not just rhetoric. And we're seeing it in Florida, where we have joined, what is it, Mississippi and Arkansas and West Virginia, the handful of states that have passed these bans against trans athletes. We are seeing a spike in violence against trans kids in school. We are seeing reports of parents calling for the gender of a child that bested their child in competition because of the rhetoric that has surrounded this. So the work of passing the Equality Act is also the work of educating our state and our nation on the lived experience and the real life stories of these kids who have become a political football for extremists.
And Chris, if I could, I would jump in and I would underscore everything and endorse everything that Andy and Nadine said, and I would add to that, in terms of what makes this moment so unique among the past 50 years, almost 50 years that we've been trying to get this done, is that we sort of have all of the ingredients for success this time around. We've got this really significant public support that both of them talked about. Really strange bedfellows, right? Progressives as well as conservatives, businesses as well as labor unions, elected officials, people of faith. It's a really broad and deep coalition of folks who have come together in consensus around the fact that this actually needs to get done. And I can understand for anybody who's watching the news right now, they might wonder how it is possible to get anything done in Washington and get people to agree on stuff. And the good news with this issue is that there is a lot of agreement. And at the same time, we have sort of the ingredients for success in DC. We have a president who wants this bill on his desk. We have congressional leadership who want to pass it. We've already seen it get through the House on a bipartisan basis. It had a really strong hearing in the Senate already, where lawmakers on both sides of the aisle were talking about their desire to get this done. So we're very much poised to get it done. And, I think, to what Andy was saying about what's happening in the States and to what Nadine was explaining, there is no greater, example of why it's important that we seize this moment and get it done than the fact that discrimination is alive and well in the States. And this is a really clear way that Congress could come out and say, that is not what our country stands for.
Yeah, thank you. Notice at the bottom, we have the website address, passtheequalityact.com. I just want to call that out, direct folks to that link. You can go after our chat, you can go now in another browser, passtheequalityact.com. We want to direct you to there to take action. Nadine, something you said in the last answer really struck me. And when you're talking about the violence against our community, in hearing the rhetoric that's been thrown around both by the media and by lawmakers this legislative session, we've seen drastic increases in calls to crisis hotlines from trans and non-binary youth in those states where anti-trans sports bills have been mentioned or discussed, in the states where healthcare bills have been introduced. And so we know there's a very real impact, and we know that the Equality Act is sweeping in its reach. So wondering if you could start us off in breaking down just how will the Equality Act impact the lives of LGBTQ folks?
Well, I think part of what laws do is they not only give you the legal framework in which you can seek a remedy, but they announce the values of a nation. They announce very clearly that in America, we don't believe that discrimination based on race, based on gender, and now based on sexual orientation and gender identity, along with all of the other protected classes, ought to exist. And that is one of the primary reasons, because we know that laws help begin to shift the expectation. And now if you are somebody who discriminates, the law is telling you are the one who is outside of our norms now as a society. And so the flip side of that is when you have this kind of hateful rhetoric, when you have this kind of dehumanizing rhetoric, you are communicating to the broader community and to the classmates of students that they're fair game, that to pick on, to belittle, and to bully is not only acceptable, it's expected because they're seeing it happen at the highest levels of government. And so, we know that the majority of people in the state of Florida aren't going to discriminate. But unfortunately, because there are those who do, we have to have a legal remedy, and we have to deliver the message collectively as a society that this is not acceptable. And so, for us, the passage of the Equality Act is that clarion call across the nation that sets a standard for how we treat everyone.
Anyone else want to jump in here on what you see the impacts of the Equality Act being on LGBTQ Americans or on our allies as well?
One thing that I would highlight is, there are 29 states, like Nadine's state, that do not yet have express protections. There are 21 states that do. But I think that folks who live in those 21 states who already have protections should not think that this is not relevant to them and that this is not necessary. I live in one of those states. I live in Los Angeles, California. It's probably not a surprise to hear that I travel a lot for work, obviously to Washington, D.C., but also to many other unprotected states as we're working to try to get these protections in place. And, when I'm on an airplane, I'm keeping track of the time, and about an hour before we're about to land, I get up, I use the restroom, I do anything else I need to do, because chances are I'm landing in one of the, 2/3 of states in the US that don't have protections. And I don't necessarily want to be hassled and have to navigate that when I can just take care of my business on the plane, go through my layover, get on the next plane, and get wherever I'm going. It just shouldn't be that way. Even people who live in protected states travel. They travel for business. They travel for pleasure. Their kids go to college. They get relocated for work. We're one country. We should be able to move from a place where we're protected to other places or travel through those places, without experiencing lesser protections. I think it gets to the symbolic nature of what Nadine was just referencing, which I think is really critical. And it also just gets to the legal realities of what people experience in their lives. We've heard lots of stories, both of people who live in unprotected states and have experienced discrimination, as well as people who've experienced discrimination traveling through those states. And it just shouldn't be that way. And we have an opportunity now to fix it.
Yeah, and I believe we just saw news that California has actually limited travel for government agencies to states that have anti-LGBTQ laws in effect. So we know that it is not universal. It is a patchwork. And I think that is surprising to folks to find out that there's not universal protections, that it is so state by state. Andy, anything to add here?
Yeah, yes. And I think there are two things that come to mind. One, I think it's a sign of hope and optimism, because I think Casey was alluding to a lot of the news headlines around and a lot of spin that's in the media about the Equality Act and its chances of passing the Senate. What I think is a good sign for Americans to be paying attention to across the country is the Supreme Court. It is a majority conservative Supreme Court. And last year, the Supreme Court 6-3 in a ruling ruled that LGBTQ plus discrimination, specifically in workplaces, was illegal and is protected under federal law. And it was a big deal because, again, the conservative majority in the Supreme Court delivered that opinion. Just this past month, we saw again the Supreme Court make a decision to decline that they were going to give government agencies the right to discriminate constitutionally against LGBTQ plus people as it pertains to agencies that receive federal public funding, specifically as it pertains to everything from providers that provide emergency shelter, emergency beds, to soup kitchens, to food pantries. And again, the Supreme Court said we're not going to rule on this. And just the other day, the Supreme Court declined to hear the Gavin Grimm matter as it relates to trans young people being able to access public school facilities that are consistent with their gender identity. We are seeing a Supreme Court, again, a majority conservative Supreme Court, make it very clear that they are not interested in endorsing constitutional discrimination against LGBTQ plus people, which is, I think, both an exciting development as well as a signal that, again, there is broad support for the Equality Act. The other thing that I do want to add, though, and Nadine did touch upon this, these state bills are impacting people's lives. And again, it speaks to the need for us to have federal legislation, a federal standard that protects everyone, because the aftermath of these bad bills are impacting our most vulnerable in our community, particularly our young people, trans young people. In Arkansas, where the governor, we saw them pass an anti-trans bill specifically criminalizing gender-affirming healthcare for trans young people, we're hearing of families fleeing the state so that they can make sure that their children can access the medically necessary care that they deserve. And we know that there are very bad educational and mental health outcomes that correlate with these kinds of political developments that are emerging across the country. When we think about our trans young people or LGBTQ plus young people in general, many of whom avoid extracurricular activities or athletics because they already feel unsafe. We're seeing anti-trans sports bans specifically pop up, and we know that's impacting young people and it's sending the wrong message. And the last thing I will say, and this is on a personal note, for the life of me, I don't know why our opponents would target trans young people. It doesn't make any sense. It is cruel. It is politically vindictive. And if there is any optimism, and I am an optimistic person, I believe our opponents are going to fail miserably simply because of the tactics that they are using in this moment.
Yeah, thank you so much. So many important points there. And I know as a board member of Point of Pride, which is an organization that provides affirming healthcare resources to trans and non-binary young people in particular, but all people across the globe who ask for it, we saw a drastic increase in requests for binders, gaffs, of access to affirming care as soon as these bills were introduced in states across the country. And we know that there's a very real impact just by having these bills being discussed, even if they're not being passed. So thank you for our big picture view. I just want to take just a brief moment as a reminder, say we will be answering questions at the end, so please continue to drop them in the chat. If you're just joining us, you're joining us right now for a conversation about the Equality Act. Thank you again to Lush Cosmetics for providing this space for us tonight. And right now you can contact your senator by clicking the link in the chat box. So please click that link. I'd love to now sort of zoom in. You talked about the state level, and we talked about a couple of states already, but I think it's really important to call out at the very beginning of Pride Month, the state of Florida. Governor Ron DeSantis signed an anti-trans sports bill into law in that state. So the state is really top of mind for me, with that being the most recent one passed. And this year we've seen anti-LGBTQ plus bills in Florida pass for the first time in, Nadine, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's over 2 decades. So I'm wondering, Nadine, can you tell us a little bit more about what's happening in Florida? Why Florida? Why this moment in time? And then we can open it up to other states.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it has everything to do with whether the governor is going to be running for president or vice president. And he's pandering to an extremist wing within the base. It doesn't really even reflect the majority of where Republicans are. And so, the trans ban that passed in Florida did not pass through regular order. In fact, that bill was declared dead even by the Senate sponsor. And then in the 11th hour, they tacked it on to a bill, an unrelated bill, and moved it through with no public comment. And what they were experiencing in the hearings were parents and people in the community and teammates and coaches speaking out and saying, why are you doing this to trans kids? Why would you deny trans kids access to sports? And so, the optimist in me believes that they are addicted to a kind of extremist pandering that has a limited ability to move people, but they can't help themselves. right? And so I think in the same way that, in some ways the far right's attack on marriage equality caused a lot of people who weren't really thinking that marriage equality was the highest priority in the movement to suddenly have to fight back. And a lot of people who never considered themselves political were suddenly having conversations about marriage equality with their families. And I think the same thing is happening around trans youth in sports and the existence of transgender people, because at the root of it, what the far right is really trying to do when they attack trans young people, visibility on campus, and trans young people access to healthcare, what they're really trying to say is you don't exist, and we will not affirm your existence. And that's not where the majority of Americans are. That's not where the majority of Floridians are. So rather than come right out and say that, they think if we make your life a living hell, we will, in the same way that they think that making life hell for people, the LGBT community will keep us all in the closet. And so I think that our response has to be the same, which is to continue to lift up stories, have young people talk for themselves. And in Florida, a 13-year-old trans girl is suing the state of Florida and suing the governor. She's played soccer since she was 7 years old. She's going to be expelled from her team and go through that humiliation. And so she's suing. And, we think that's the one of a few lawsuits that are coming. But this is a governor who has passed a number, pushed for the passage of a number of bills that are in court and now being, challenged as unconstitutional. So it is unfortunate that Florida has sort of become a stage for the most extreme strategies of the Republican Party because of DeSantis's presidential hopes. And, what our hope is, what we will do is use it to educate people, shift the political conscience of our state, and the votes and elections will follow.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I want to share that in, a couple of years ago, there was a statewide ballot measure in Massachusetts. It was the first statewide vote on transgender rights anywhere in the country. It was an effort to repeal a non-discrimination law that we had passed. And, the stakes were very high. We knew if we lost that we would probably see ballot measures like that all over the country. And this was back when much of the discussion was focused around transgender people using restrooms, whereas now it's focused on transgender people playing sports and accessing best practice medical care. And one of the things that happened during that campaign was Massachusetts has early voting, and voting began 2 weeks before actual election day. And that happened to be the same day that people may remember then President Trump announced that they were going through all of the federal administrative regulations, et cetera, to try to redefine sex to mean, to basically exclude transgender people and to define sex as based on, a person's biology at birth, whatever that means. But we know what their intent was. And we were really worried that the president taking an action like that would embolden people. This effort, you would think that Massachusetts is so blue, this would be so easy, but this is not an easy issue for people who are not familiar with transgender people. These, stereotypes and myths that are spread about us relative to bathrooms and sports, and it takes some effort to overcome them with people who just don't know us very well. And, we were sort of knocking on doors, trying to educate people as quickly as we could. And we were really worried when he took this action that that we were done, that this would really embolden people to vote against us, kind of give them permission, because this is like the highest office in the land saying it's okay to treat transgender people like they're not real. And it had the opposite effect. All of a sudden, we had so much turnout, so much volunteerism happening. We barely had the capacity to handle all the people who wanted to volunteer. I came across somebody when I was knocking on doors who was on another canvassing team who said to me this was the first time she'd ever come out, not a transgender person, an ally, first time she'd ever come out to work on a political issue of any kind ever, because she just couldn't deal with all of the punching down and all of the bullying. It just wasn't right. And she felt she had to do something about it. And so, I know this was already said, and I just want to reinforce that we know from experience that, what we're seeing happening in the States right now, it will backfire. because the majority of people in this country really are fair-minded, and whatever they may or may not know about LGBTQ people, they do believe in treating people with dignity and respect. And they can see when something is not fair and when something is not treating somebody with respect. They can tell the difference between when it is and isn't. And I think this current moment really will backfire. And as unfortunate as it is that it's happening, and as harmful and dangerous as it is for the families that it's impacting, it makes the best case for the need for non-discrimination protections than we could possibly make on our own without people coming out and acting in such a discriminatory way. So I just wanted to share that to offer folks some hope that we actually do have evidence that these kinds of things do backfire, and that it does tend to wake a sleeping giant who will stand with us and help us get the protections that we need.
Yeah, and I love that. I think there's absolutely a lot of reason to have hope, right? It was mentioned earlier that you said a majority of people are fair-minded, and the statistics back that up. Over 70% of Americans support the Equality Act. We've seen over 400 businesses sign on to letters to support the Equality Act. We've seen a lot of support that's not necessarily reflected in the values of some of the lawmakers who've been discussing it, but in terms of progress versus what you had mentioned in our previous presidential administration, tonight the White House is holding its first ever convening on transgender equality. And so we have seen that is a huge step, very exciting step. And folks can watch that in the replay because I think it's happening right now as well. So, speaking of hope, I think, let's shift to some more tangible things about some action items. So we have some questions from the audience coming in, and I just want to encourage people to continue to drop those questions in the chat, and we have some time for them. Let's start off with, what is something tangible that I can do or that my business can do to support this right now?
Well, I would say, as a business leader, speak to your Chamber of Commerce, speak to your city council, explain to them why it is important to you as a job creator in your community that you're able to create a hospitable environment for employees. We've talked to businesses that say, it is difficult for us to move people around the country, to the place where they can have a better impact on our company and our effectiveness, because now we have to say, what are the laws in that state, in that city, around that campus, and how will it affect them, their spouse, their child, all of those kinds of things. So I think the voices of business leaders, especially small businesses, because small businesses create more jobs than the major corporations, to say, this is important to me, and I expect to see my city standing up and pushing for those things. It is not an accident that at the local level, you see strong bipartisan support for the passage of sexual orientation and gender identity protections. In a state like Florida, where we have a really hostile legislature that became more hostile. Even moderates who've been with us have sort of kissed the ring of Trump in this last legislative session in ways, even if they were privately saying, we think this bill is terrible, we wish we didn't have to, but this is the new standard and we've got to show our loyalty. That's not what we see at the local level. We see strong bipartisan support at the local level for these kinds of protections. So I would say, as a business leader, and even if you're not a business leader, make sure that leaders in your community, Republicans in particular, are hearing from you, and encourage them to talk to their senators and their House members and tell them how important you want, not just voting for it, but you want to see them leading on this.
I would, in addition to what Nadine said, I would say that if you are a small business owner, chances are other small business owners, and this is a prime opportunity to organize and to demonstrate your support for the Equality Act. Whether you post a sign or a sticker in your small business, you post something on your website or your social media. This is an exciting time to organize, and I think for small businesses in particular, growing up as a young queer person, as a young trans person, I remember some of the most supportive and safe environments that I felt comfortable being myself in were the small cafes, were the small bookstores, and this is an exciting time for businesses to demonstrate their support. And I don't want to steal Casey's thunder, but the other thing I will add is vote. Call your senators right now and ask them to support the Equality Act. There is a need for phone calls. It is a very old-fashioned and simple thing to do, but it is right now really necessary for your senators to hear exactly why you support the Equality Act and why they should vote on it.
Yeah, and I would add to that, this, not only do we have a historic opportunity in this moment, but the window is actually really short. The stars have aligned, but we go through another election cycle next November. And pretty soon, senators, where the bill is awaiting a vote, senators are going to get on with the business of getting ready for their elections, and they're going to kind of stop legislating. So there is a moment this year between now and the end of the year where we really need to get this done. And so this is the time for, to what Andy was saying, stole my thunder a little bit, but I think it bears repeating, so it's okay. This is the time for folks who really want to see this get done, who believe in fairness and dignity and respect, to get on the phone, to send letters, to send emails to your senator. And to my earlier point, that can be your senator, whether you live in a state that has protections or not, whether you have a senator who has already signed on to the bill or not. Everybody every senator needs to hear from constituents that this needs to be a priority this year and they need to get it done. They have a very full agenda. It is a very difficult chamber right now to get things done in. And so they really, really need to hear from people that this is the moment and that they need to prioritize it and they need to get it done. And we are always, this is all we do all day long at Freedom for All Americans. Once this bill passes, we will close down. This is our sole mission. I would love for you all to put me out of a job. But we are always looking for people to take actions. And for folks who are interested in learning more about how to do that, you can go to our website at freedomforallamericans.org. You can follow us on Twitter at Freedom for All USA. There are constantly opportunities for ways to engage at key moments. And we would love for anyone who's energized around this and wants to participate to get engaged with us.
It's such a good point. I mean, there's plenty of thunder to go around on this point, that this is not just about presidential elections. This is very much about state and local elections as well. And making your voice heard. We know that every single phone call, every email matters, it counts. And it becomes very easy for us to go, I'm just one person. What does my voice matter? What does it matter? Or I'm afraid to make that call. And it's worth noting that quite often it's an aide who's answering the phone. You leave a brief message, but it's so critical that we make our voice heard because we certainly know that the folks who are against us are making their voices heard. Mm-hmm. So, with that, Andy, you mentioned organizing and talking to other business owners as part of your answer. That's a great segue into another audience question. It says, I'm having trouble talking to my friends about why this is so important. If you were to talk to them, what would you say? So how can we have conversations about this? How can we talk to other people?
It's a great question, and I'll give one example, and it's not relevant to everyone, but I think personal conversations and personal stories really change hearts and minds. I can cite case law, I can talk about the Supreme Court, we can do policy analysis, but we know that's not gonna move hearts and minds on this issue. And when talking about the Equality Act and in persuading people to listen and to pay attention and to inevitably support the Equality Act, personal stories are important. I think some of the most effective messengers in this work that I have seen in the trans movement have been parents. Parents have stepped up in big and unexpected ways to talk about why protections for their children are important. Many of these parents are coming from both sides of the political aisle. Many of these parents have never organized or have engaged in LGBTQ plus activism before, and they're fired up because they know that the future of their children hinges on the moment that we're in right now. And so parents have been calling their elected officials, their senators. They've been talking to their neighbors, their community members. They've shown up at rallies because they as parents are talking about why they need to protect their children and make sure that there is a bright and hopeful future for their children to inherit.
You know, I cannot agree more that those interpersonal conversations that aren't all technical and legalese. In fact, I would go back to the marriage fight and I would say, the moment our movement stopped talking about all of the rights and responsibilities and started telling love stories about why people wanted to get married, why they wanted to take care of the people that they loved, the conversation shifted. And I think one of the things that is important for people to understand is that, intensity matters. And our opposition can be very intense. And have an impact beyond their numbers. And so it becomes really important to remember what it feels like to lose your job, to be too afraid to access a public restroom because you're afraid you'll be harassed, physically assaulted, questioned by authorities, to be an 8-year-old playing soccer and to listen to this debate unfold and have to deal with what it means to have grown-ups talking about you in this way and wonder whether or not you're going to have to explain to your teammates why you can't play anymore. We have to make this real to people. And I would say if you're having trouble talking to your friends, help them understand that this isn't a theoretical exercise. There are people who have had their livelihoods, their ability to take care of themselves and the people they love snatched away from them. There are people who live in fear of being in public space because their ability to move through public space is constantly contested. These are the things that our nation has grappled with. You know, my father had to deal with the Green Book. He had to, as they traveled across the country, the places they could and could not go. We should be eliminating that same dynamic now. And what we are seeing is this pull in two directions: an America that embraces diversity, inclusion, and respect, and an America that is nostalgic for a time that never existed, but tells people to go back in the closet, hide, and if you don't hide, any harm that comes to you is your own fault. So these are the two Americas. These are the choices that we have. And those of us who are on the side of that progress, we have to be willing to raise our voice and be in places and use some volume and intensity, because the people who have terrible ideas about who we are and are willing to spread those ideas are not shy whatsoever in doing that. And I would say increase your intensity, your visibility, and your voice, if only to ensure that next 8-year-old, 10-year-old, 13-year-old hears your voice over theirs.
Yeah, absolutely. This is not about theory. This is about real people, 4 of whom are sitting right here having this conversation. So let's personalize this as we wrap this up. Question from the audience: if you had to pinpoint one moment in your life that led you to really get behind this movement, what would it be? Any of our panelists want to share? Great question.
I'm happy to go first on that. I think for me, I grew up in California, actually Southern California, in a pretty small conservative town. Those exist; they still exist. And I didn't know anything about gay people at all, really, except for negative things. This was in the 80s during the AIDS crisis. And I didn't know transgender people even existed. I just had no clue at all. And so in a lot of ways, I really had no idea what was going on with me, but I had a pretty good sense that whatever it was probably not something I ever wanted to do anything about or let anybody else know about. And I left my hometown to go away to school when I was 17 and a half. And that is kind of when everything changed, because I was in a different environment. It became impossible for me to ignore who I am. And, I kind of went on a journey to learn more about this community that I'm part of, that I didn't learn anything about as a kid, because most of us grow up in families where we don't learn anything about this community that we're part of. And I realized through that process that because of who I am, I didn't have all the rights and protections that I thought I had. And I learned that that's actually really true for a lot of communities. It's not just limited to the LGBTQ community. And, you know, I had been taught growing up that if you see a problem, take responsibility for fixing it. And that was sort of the moment when I realized I didn't know exactly how I was going to show up and what exactly my role would be. But I knew that I wanted to work on these issues. And, you know, I'm an eternal optimist that believes that we really can move people on these issues. Sometimes we have to be patient and it takes time and we have to keep trying, but we can move people. I've seen people in my hometown move because of their experience with me. And I know that's happening in places all over the country. But, you know, for me, this is, as a transgender man, this is personal. It's my life. And I'm in it because not everybody has been as lucky as I have been in their journey and receiving the support that I've received as I've come out. I want to make things better for kids than it was for me when I was figuring out how I was going to live the life that I was born to lead.
Amazing. Thank you. Andy?
I'll jump in and say that I knew at a very, it's like a coming out story in many ways. I knew at a very young age of who I am, who I was, and there were no possibility models. There were no TV shows like Pose. There were no books. There were no organizations. And I grew up in in upstate New York, and also a conservative suburb. And I felt alone and isolated. And quite frankly, I didn't think I had a future. I didn't know how I was going to graduate from high school and go to college and get a job because of me being a trans woman. I didn't know if I would have a future in being able to live the quote unquote American dream and find a partner and have a family and to be a part of my local community. And on the flip side of that, I also grew up in a home where servant leadership was a core value, putting the last first. And so I made a choice. I decided to intentionally look for opportunities in the LGBTQ plus community to volunteer, to get involved, to learn. And if it weren't for that desire to learn and to get involved and to try to make a difference, at the time, not, you know, for myself, I don't think I would be in the position that I'm in today. And I look back on that moment in my life and I realized that it wasn't just about me. It was about future me's and making sure that LGBTQ plus people who come after me do not experience the same kinds of experiences that I think many of us on this call have had to confront or encounter, and making sure that our people have a bright future ahead of them.
Wow. Well, you know, when people ask me when I came out, I say third grade, and I tell them I knew I was out in third grade because I had a girlfriend, and I knew I had a girlfriend because she told everybody she was my girlfriend. She also told our teacher that we were going to get married, and this was my favorite teacher. You know, the teacher that you accidentally call mom. And I remember our teacher kept us in during a break, and she told me in a very serious tone, both of us, that girls had to marry boys and boys had to marry girls. And I remember just being absolutely devastated. And we sat under the tree where we always sat for lunch, you know, and she cried and I plotted. And I went up to I had functioning gaydar. And I went up to the gayest boy, I'll call him Casey for this. I used to tell the real names of these characters in the story, and somebody wanted to Google them. I thought, oh, don't do anyway. And I said, listen, Casey, here's what's going to happen. You're going to marry Marie, and no, actually, you and I are going to get married, and Marie is going to come live with us after her husband is killed in the war. And that was my organizing plan. But it was really the first time I got this message so clearly that I was not supposed to exist, and that the people closest to me would hurt me if they knew this. And so when we encounter homophobic lawmakers or activists, It never surprises us to discover that they're struggling with their own sexuality, because many of us, I'm an example of somebody who internalized that so much that I was the one making anti-gay jokes. I was the one making sure nobody thought I was one of them. And so for me, this journey has been getting that poison out of my system. It's, it has been the political work, but it's also been the personal work of learning that my life was worth fighting for, and then committing to be the adult that I wish had been around in my world, so that I didn't have to go through the depth of denial and just all of the pain of that. And so it's why I'm an optimist, because I'm not fueled by rage and an unquenchable fury. I'm really inspired by so many people whose names, the people, not celebrities necessarily, but just the people who stood up at different moments in my life and been who I needed to see. The lesbian couple holding hands on the Staten Island ferry when I was, 13 years old, even as kids were walking by and making comments, and they just stared at each other with absolute love. They're heroes of mine. I have no idea what their names are, but they were there in a moment, and they lit a path for me. So I want to be that adult in this world.
Absolutely. I relate to that so much. My motto is actually now on a t-shirt. It says, be who you needed when you were younger. I feel that so much. And we have this real opportunity to be those people for a younger generation. So let's close with this. We have 2 minutes. We're going to do this in 90 seconds. Your Twitter version, your 140 characters, your one line of a call to action for anybody who's joined us tonight. And thank you so much to Lush Cosmetics for creating this space. What step can someone take right now, tonight, or within the next 24 hours to help create change? Let's start with you, Andy.
I am not going to steal Casey's thunder. So I am going to diversify my answer and say, for anyone watching, identify your favorite business that you buy a product from or you take part in a service from, whether it's like a gym or your favorite restaurant, and ask them to support the Equality Act.
I'll go next. I will say, go on social media, tag your senators, tag your House members, come out with full-throated support for the passage of the Equality Act, and then join your state equality organization, and they'll put you to work, guaranteed.
I will add, call your senator, call your senator, call your senator. You can do it more than once. Lush has a link, has a platform that you can use to do it. You get support with sample talking points. You can go to our website at freedomforamericans.org and get the same kind of support. I cannot emphasize it enough. As soon as you get off this, call your senator. You can call at night. Don't need to call during the day. Call your senator.
Perfect. Yes, take action. Urge your senators to support the Equality Act. Urge your small businesses. Urge your friends. We have this opportunity right now. This is a critical moment. And as so many of our panelists mentioned, the stars have aligned. And so now is the time. Thank you so much to our incredible panelists, Andy, Casey, and Nadine, for joining us in this very important conversation about the Equality Act. Thank you to Lush Cosmetics for creating this space. Please follow their organizations: Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, Equality Florida, Freedom for All Americans, and transathlete.com. And please click that link in the chat and take action now. Let's pass the Equality Act. Thank you so much, everyone.